Thanks very much for joining me. Let's not beat around the bush. What we are watching right now with this so-called outrage over Jimmy Kimmel is not really about a joke. It is not really about whether a late-night host crossed some imaginary line of decency. It is about power. It is about Donald Trump and his Republican allies trying, once again, to silence any voice that dares to criticize them. Think about this. We live in a country where Donald Trump can call immigrants animals. We live in a country where his allies in Congress can stand on the House floor and accuse Democrats of being part of some imaginary pedophile cabal. We live in a country where right-wing media personalities can spew lies day after day about COVID vaccines, about stolen elections, about climate change being a hoax, and yet they face no meaningful consequences, none. But the moment a comedian, a satirist, someone whose job is literally to poke holes in hypocrisy, dares to turn his humor against Trump and his Republican Party, suddenly we are told this is a national crisis. Suddenly the FCC is getting involved. Suddenly the networks are panicking. Suddenly the same people who chant about free speech every time a billionaire is criticized are demanding that a man lose his platform because he said something they did not like. That, my friends, is the definition of a double standard. Now, we can argue about taste, we can argue about timing, but let us be absolutely clear. Jimmy Kimmel's so-called offense is not that he made a bad joke. His offense, in the eyes of Trump and his allies, is that he told a story they did not want to hear. He drew a line between political violence and the atmosphere of hate that the Republican Party has cultivated for years. He suggested, in his way, that the real danger in America is not from comedians, not from satire, but from a political movement that traffics in cruelty, conspiracy, and division. And what happened? Immediately, the machinery of right-wing outrage was cranked into motion. FCC commissioners, handpicked by Trump, suddenly discovered that they care deeply about standards. Network executives started receiving phone calls. Advertisers began whispering about pulling their dollars, and within days, Kimmel's show, one of the few mainstream platforms where Trump and his lies are ridiculed on a nightly basis, was suspended. Ask yourself, is that an accident? Is it a coincidence? Of course not. This is the playbook. Republicans lose an argument, they lose the moral high ground, and instead of engaging on the facts, they weaponize power to silence the critic. They did it with university professors, they did it with public health officials. They are doing it now with comedians. And unless we stop them, they will do it with every journalist, every activist, every teacher who dares to tell the truth about what their party is doing to this country. Let me remind you of something. Donald Trump and his allies love to talk about cancel culture. They rail against it on Fox News every night. But what is the biggest cancel culture operation in America today? It is the Republican Party itself. It is Ron DeSantis banning books in Florida schools. It is Republican legislatures across the country trying to erase Black history, erase LGBTQ voices, erase any curriculum that makes them uncomfortable. It is Trump suing newspapers, suing social media platforms, suing anybody who dares to shine a light on his corruption. And now it is Jimmy Kimmel. So when we talk about what happened here, we must not get lost in the weeds of whether a joke was too harsh or whether the timing was right. The issue here is not Jimmy Kimmel's punchline. The issue is the political climate, that Republicans have created a climate where they can say anything, do anything, and face no consequences, while anybody who challenges them is immediately targeted for destruction. This is not freedom. This is not democracy. This is authoritarianism creeping in through the back door of our culture. And if you think it ends with late-night television, you are mistaken. Because once they silence comedians, they will silence journalists. Once they silence journalists, they will silence teachers. And once they silence teachers, they will silence you. The truth is, the outrage campaign against Kimmel tells us more about Donald Trump and the Republican Party than it does about late-night comedy. It tells us that they are terrified. Terrified of humor, terrified of dissent, terrified of anything that punctures the lies they depend on to hold power. Because if the American people ever fully understood how much corruption, how much cruelty, how much contempt for working people is baked into the Republican agenda, Trump and his allies would never win another election. And that is why they need to attack the comedians. Because humor has always been one of the most powerful weapons against bullies and demagogues. So let us call this what it is. Not a controversy about a television joke, not a debate about whether comedy has gone too far. This is an attack on dissent. This is an attempt by Trump and his Republican enablers to rig not just our elections with gerrymandering and voter suppression, but to rig our culture to make sure that only their voices are heard and that every critic is silenced. And we cannot let that happen. What happened after Kimmel's monologue was not spontaneous outrage from everyday Americans. It was a coordinated effort, engineered and amplified by the Republican Party and their billionaire allies. And we need to talk about how these attacks unfold, because they follow a very familiar script. Step one, a prominent critic of Trump says something that lands a punch. In this case, Jimmy Kimmel dared to connect the dots between political violence and the culture of hate that has been cultivated by the MAGA movement. Step two, right-wing media outlets, Fox News, Newsmax, Talk Radio, immediately take that clip, strip it of all context, and run it around the clock. They repeat it so many times that by the end of the day, what was originally satire looks like a declaration of war. Step three, the politicians jump in. Trump himself posts on Truth Social. Republican members of Congress put out statements. Suddenly you have a chorus of outrage that is impossible to ignore. And step four, corporate America, the networks, the advertisers, the boards of directors start to panic. They see the noise, they see the headlines, they see the threats of boycotts, and they fold. This is how cancel culture really works in America today. It is not grassroots, it is not organic. It is manufactured outrage designed to protect the Republican Party from criticism. And in Kimmel's case, it worked exactly as intended. But here's what makes this story even more revealing. Look at who did not get punished. Look at the voices that are never held accountable. Tucker Carlson spent years spreading lies about COVID, lies that literally cost American lives. Did Fox ever suspend him for that? No. In fact, they gave him a prime time slot and paid him tens of millions of dollars. Donald Trump himself told the American people that the 2020 election was stolen, a lie that led directly to the violent insurrection on January 6th. Has he ever been held accountable for spreading that lie? Not yet. So ask yourself, why is it that Jimmy Kimmel gets suspended for making a political joke, while Republican politicians and media figures get rewarded for spreading dangerous, deadly disinformation? The answer is simple. Because this is not about standards. This is not about fairness. This is about power. And that power is being wielded once again to protect the interests of the Republican Party and Donald Trump. Now, the Republicans will say, well, Kimmel crossed the line. He was disrespectful. He should have known better. But I want you to think about how many lines Donald Trump himself has crossed. This is a man who mocked a disabled reporter at a campaign rally. This is a man who bragged on tape about sexually assaulting women. This is a man who called the countries of Africa and the Caribbean shitholes. This is a man who suggested injecting bleach as a cure for COVID. And yet, somehow, he continues to be treated as a legitimate political figure, and Jimmy Kimmel is the one who gets pulled off the air. That tells you everything you need to know about how skewed the playing field has become. The double standard is glaring. When conservatives attack Democrats, when they demean women, when they insult immigrants, when they spread lies about elections or pandemics, that is treated as free speech. When progressives or satirists push back, when they use humor to expose the hypocrisy of the right, suddenly it is dangerous. Suddenly it is unacceptable. Suddenly it must be silenced. And it goes beyond late-night television. We are watching the same dynamic play out in classrooms, in libraries, in local governments. Republicans are banning books that discuss America's history of racism. They are threatening teachers who talk honestly about climate change or gender identity. They are punishing corporations that refuse to toe the MAGA line. And they are using every tool of government, from state legislatures to the Supreme Court, to enforce their version of reality. That is not democracy. That is not free speech. That is authoritarianism dressed up as outrage. And let me tell you something else. The real target here is not Jimmy Kimmel. It is not late-night comedy. The real target is every single person in this country who dares to question Donald Trump and his Republican enablers. Because if they can silence a comedian with millions of viewers, if they can scare the biggest entertainment corporation in America into submission, what chance does an ordinary citizen have when they speak out? That is the chilling effect they are aiming for. They want you to think twice before criticizing Trump. They want you to self-censor. They want you to keep your head down and stay quiet while they dismantle our democracy piece by piece. And the truth is, this is not happening in a vacuum. This is part of a much larger strategy by the Republican Party to consolidate power by silencing dissent. They are already rigging congressional maps through gerrymandering. They are already making it harder for people to vote through voter suppression laws. They are already stacking the courts with right-wing ideologues who will rubber stamp their agenda for decades to come. And now they are going after culture. They are going after the comedians, the artists, the teachers, the journalists, because they know that culture shapes politics. They know that laughter, satire, and dissent are powerful weapons against tyranny. So when we talk about Jimmy Kimmel's suspension, let us understand it for what it really is. It is one front in a broader war being waged by Trump and his Republican Party against the very idea of democracy itself. And if we do not fight back, if Democrats, independents, and every American who believes in free speech and fair play does not raise their voices, then the bullies win, the liars win. The people who believe in silencing critics rather than debating them win. We cannot let that happen. What we also need to be absolutely clear about is this. The Republican outrage machine doesn't just silence voices. It rewrites reality. Look at what happened in the days after Jimmy Kimmel's monologue. Within hours, Fox News and right-wing social media figures were not only condemning Kimmel, they were spreading false narratives about what he supposedly said. They exaggerated, they distorted, they clipped videos out of context, and they turned a segment of satire into what they claimed was proof of liberal hatred for America. This is what Republicans have perfected under Donald Trump. They take a grain of truth, wrap it in lies, and blast it through their media echo chamber until millions of people believe something that is simply not real. And it works because they have built an entire ecosystem designed for one purpose: to protect the powerful and to divide ordinary Americans against each other. We saw the same thing with January 6th. Trump and his allies incited a violent mob to attack the Capitol in an attempt to overturn an election. The facts are crystal clear. Thousands of hours of footage, hundreds of guilty pleas, dozens of convictions. Yet within days, Fox News was spinning a story about peaceful tourists and Antifa infiltrators. They took a national tragedy and tried to erase the truth. We saw the same thing with COVID. Trump downplayed the virus, called it a hoax, mocked masks, and pushed quack cures. His allies on right-wing radio spread disinformation that literally cost lives. And when the death toll mounted, They turned around and blamed Dr. Fauci, blamed Democrats, blamed anyone but themselves. And now we see it again with Jimmy Kimmel. A late-night comedian criticizes Trump's movement, and suddenly the entire weight of the Republican media apparatus comes down on him like a hammer. Not because of what he actually said, but because of what they want people to believe he said. Why does this matter? Because it shows us how fragile truth has become in the United States of America. We are living in a moment when millions of people, tens of millions of people, are being fed a steady diet of lies every single day. Lies about our elections, lies about our economy, lies about immigrants, lies about who is responsible for violence in this country. And those lies don't just confuse people, they radicalize them. They turn neighbor against neighbor. They make political violence more likely. They erode the very foundation of democracy, which is the idea that we can at least agree on a common set of facts, even if we disagree about solutions. Donald Trump understands this. He thrives on it. He knows that if you can control what people believe, you don't have to persuade them with logic or policy. You just have to give them a story that makes them angry, a story that makes them afraid, a story that makes them feel like victims of some vast conspiracy. And Jimmy Kimmel, for all his flaws, for all his missteps, was a target because he dared to break that narrative. He dared to point the finger back at the people who have been stoking division and hatred for years. And the Republican response was not to debate him, not to counter him with facts, but to crush him, to silence him, to make him an example of what happens when you challenge their reality. This is not new. This is how authoritarians operate all over the world. In Russia, Putin cracks down on journalists who tell the truth about his corruption or his wars. In Hungary, Orban silences comedians and writers who satirize his government. In Turkey, Erdogan jails opposition voices and censors the press. And in America, Trump and his allies may not yet have the power to throw people in jail for speaking out, but they use every other tool they can get their hands on, from smear campaigns to boycotts to threats of regulation, to achieve the same result. And let's be honest, the Republicans are succeeding because too many of our institutions are letting them succeed. Corporations cave at the first sign of controversy. Networks surrender before a fight even begins. Sponsors pull their ads at the first whiff of backlash, and in doing so, they empower the very people who want to dismantle democracy in this country. So here is the fundamental question. Do we want to live in a country where late-night hosts, journalists, teachers, and ordinary citizens are free to speak their minds, even if they ruffle feathers? Or do we want to live in a country where truth itself is determined by how loudly Donald Trump and his allies scream? Because make no mistake, this is not about Jimmy Kimmel. This is not about one comedian, one network, or one bad joke. This is about whether truth can survive in an America where one political party has decided that lies are more useful than facts. And here is the good news. History shows us that lies may win the battle, but truth wins the war if we are willing to fight for it. That means supporting independent media that holds the powerful accountable. That means demanding that corporations and networks stand up to smear campaigns rather than caving to them. That means organizing, voting, and building movements that are rooted in reality, not fantasy. And above all, it means refusing to be silent, because silence is exactly what Donald Trump and the Republican Party are counting on. Now, let us talk about the hypocrisy at the core of this Republican outrage. For years, Republicans have insisted that they are the defenders of free speech. They tell us they are the party that stands up against so-called cancel culture. They tell us that liberals and progressives are too sensitive, that Democrats want to silence conservative voices, that comedians should be able to joke about anything. That's what they say. But when the jokes are about them, when the spotlight turns to their cruelty, their corruption, their incompetence, suddenly they want censorship, suddenly they want networks to pull the plug. Suddenly they want people fired, silenced, punished. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot cry about cancel culture one day and then lead a campaign to cancel Jimmy Kimmel the next. That is not defending free speech. That is weaponizing free speech for your own political gain. Think about Donald Trump himself. This is a man who has spent years attacking the press. He has called journalists the enemy of the people. He has encouraged violence against reporters. He has tried to strip broadcasting licenses from networks that dared to criticize him. He has openly mused about using government power to punish media outlets that publish stories he doesn't like. And now his allies are doing the same thing with late night comedy. They don't want freedom of speech. They want freedom for their speech and censorship for everyone else. That is the definition of authoritarianism. It is the same pattern we see everywhere in Republican politics today. They scream about the Constitution while trying to overturn elections. They claim to be patriots while attacking police officers on January 6th. They talk about freedom while pushing laws to control women's bodies, censor classrooms, and ban books. And here is the dangerous part. When that hypocrisy is not called out, when it is allowed to fester, it reshapes our culture. It normalizes the idea that one set of rules applies to Republicans and another set applies to everyone else. It conditions people to accept double standards as if they are natural, as if they are inevitable. But we cannot accept that, because once you accept that, democracy itself begins to crumble. Now, I want to say something about Jimmy Kimmel and late night comedy more broadly. No, comedians are not perfect. They make mistakes, they cross lines, sometimes they go too far. That is part of what happens in a free society. But here is the difference. When Democrats, when progressives, when people on the left go too far, they apologize. They face the music. They are held accountable by their own supporters. When Republicans go too far, when Trump goes too far, when Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or J.D. Vance go too far, what happens? They double down. They revel in cruelty. They wear their most hateful statements as a badge of honor. And then they accuse anyone who objects of being woke or part of the deep state. That is the difference between a movement that is trying to get things right and a movement that thrives on never being right at all. And that brings us to the role of corporate America, because here again we see the imbalance. When Fox News broadcasts lies that literally incite violence, and we saw this with the Dominion lawsuit, when we learned that Fox anchors knowingly spread false claims about the 2020 election, what happened? They paid a settlement, sure, but did their network get pulled off the air? Did their advertisers abandon them en masse? No. They are still there, day after day, pumping out propaganda. But when a liberal comedian criticizes Trump and Republicans don't like it, suddenly networks panic. Suddenly advertisers flee. Suddenly entire shows are canceled. That is not balance. That is not accountability. That is corporate cowardice. And it reflects a truth that we must be honest about. Corporations care far more about protecting their bottom line than protecting democracy. This is why we cannot rely on Disney or ABC or any other corporation to do the right thing on their own. They will always prioritize profits over principles. If Jimmy Kimmel was still pulling in 5 million viewers a night, if his ratings were soaring, does anyone honestly believe Disney would have pulled his show off the air? Of course not. They only acted because the economics shifted, because the outrage threatened their business model. And that, my friends, is why this fight is bigger than late night television. It is about whether truth, justice, and democracy are protected only when they are convenient, or whether they are defended even when it costs money, even when it costs comfort, even when it requires standing up to the most powerful interests in the country. Because the truth is, If we allow Republicans to dictate what comedians can say, what networks can broadcast, what journalists can report, then we are one step closer to living in a country where freedom exists only for those who pledge loyalty to Donald Trump. And I don't know about you, but I will not accept that. Not now, not ever. Let us be very clear about what is going on here. This is not simply about Jimmy Kimmel or one moment on television. This is about power. It is about how Donald Trump and his Republican allies have worked tirelessly to silence voices that they do not like while protecting lies, corruption, and hate that serve their interests. The right wing has never forgiven comedians, journalists, or ordinary Americans who dared to speak truth about Trump's corruption, his authoritarianism, and his contempt for working people. They want a media environment where criticism of Trump is punished, where satire is censored, and where the only stories told are those that glorify billionaires and vilify the poor. And let's not kid ourselves. When Republicans go after late-night comedians, when they smear journalists, when they scream fake news at every tough question, they are not protecting democracy. They are undermining it. They are preparing the ground for an America where free expression exists only for the wealthy and the powerful. But here is the good news. It will not work because the American people understand what is at stake. They understand that when Trump attacks comedians or journalists, he is really attacking them, their right to know, their right to speak, their right to hold the powerful accountable. Democrats, progressives, independents, and yes, millions of ordinary Republicans who still believe in democracy must come together to say enough is enough. We will not allow Trump and his enablers to silence dissent. We will not allow them to rewrite history. We will not allow them to create a country where only their propaganda is permitted to exist. This is the choice we face. A government of billionaires, by billionaires, and for billionaires, or a democracy where the voices of ordinary people, whether through journalism, satire, or protest, are protected and respected. And let me tell you something. If we stand together, if we organize, if we fight for economic justice and political democracy, we will defeat Donald Trump and his corrupt Republican Party. We will defend freedom of speech, we will defend truth, and we will create a government that finally represents the needs of working families, not just the wealthiest few. That is the struggle before us, and that is a struggle we must win.